I can hear you now. Perfect. Yes. Forrest Maready, like spaghetti. I got it.
Yes.
It's perfect because I'm Italian, so I like spaghetti. Forrest Maready likes
It's
spaghetti.
actually an Irish name, but the
I could tell it was Irish. I knew it was Irish because that's not how Italian letters look, but I can pronounce it like spaghetti because, I like my pasta.
So you're getting a taste of what I get to deal with every day here in the studio, Forrest.
Hello, Forrest. This is Melissa.
Okay.
So nice to meet you.
Thank you. Likewise.
So
Thanks,
nice
Melissa.
to talk with you in person, not just in our quick little Facebook messages back and forth. I feel like I know you because I've read your book and I've got another one ready to go. I have not listened to all your videos like other people, so I'm behind on that. However,
That's a good thing.
I'm very, very supportive of your efforts.
Are you going to keep this up for the whole podcast, Melissa?
Keep what up? Of what are you referring, Dr. Bob?
Well, hey, Forrest, it's good to talk to you.
I'm just kidding. That
Yeah.
was just my pretend
Thanks, Bob.
accent. Wait, where are you from? Where is your accent from?
I'm from North Carolina. I have my southern accent.
Yeah, my husband's family is in North Carolina and Virginia, so it's just a hint, but I hear it.
Yeah, I used to work in Durham, right there by the baseball field.
Oh, cool.
Cool. And we had a little farm in Hillsboro, which is about 10 minutes away.
Of course you had a little farm. With that kind of accent, you have to have a little farm.
Well, it didn't take. We tried it, but it didn't take.
Did like moths come along and eat everything?
Gypsy moths.
Well,
We're laughing, but maybe
my
that's
wife
what
was
happened.
Too chicken for the country. That's what.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a different kind of life.
All
Well,
right.
Morrisville actually has a really big Indian population. And the second day after we had moved into our house, we had 3 or 4 guys come by asking if they could buy the 10 acres behind us for a cricket field.
Oh my gosh.
So it's a really eclectic farm
cricket
community
field.
out there.
Oh, that sounds relaxing.
Yeah. Well, it was our idyllic dream home, a little house on 10 acres. And then we'd been there 2 days and thought we were about to have cricket tournaments going on.
Oh gosh.
With, 100 people every weekend. So
That's
anyway.
Oh my God, I
it's
thought
good.
you meant a cricket field. Like actual crickets. You mean cricket, the sport. Listen, I used to have a chameleon and I had to buy crickets every day. So when I hear cricket, I literally think crickets. That's why I was like, oh, that sounds relaxing.
So I think
cricket is relaxing. It's a very cultural sport.
I think
Yes.
British Melissa would have
Yes.
realized
cricket.
what he was.
If you would have said it to cricket, I would have understood.
Yeah. Your
know what?
accent threw me off. I just assumed.
You know what? It's so funny. While you're doing your English accent, so Melissa's kind of like slumped over talking, and then when you go British, you like sit up, your finger goes in the air, and you start talking
Like Mary Poppins.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway,
You
wow.
can actually see a British accent on someone's mouth. I've noticed that before.
Nice.
Even with the audio off, you can see it.
Oh, I love it.
The way their
Interesting.
lips move.
The way, yeah, I get it.
They
Not even
really-
looking at their
it's
teeth.
like Wallace and Gromit. Think about how they animate those mouths
Yeah.
and the claymation stuff.
That's
That's
funny.
British.
Okay, so I'm going to welcome us in. Okay.
Okay.
When you open the door for somebody else.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Vaccine Conversation podcast with Melissa and Dr. Bob and a very special guest today. We have somebody we are going to be interviewing who's going to be discussing an amazing book that he's written that talks about a very interesting and potentially controversial theory regarding polio. And I know a lot of people are interested in this, and so was I. And so, of course, I picked up a copy of this bright red book with a blue moth on the top. Does anyone know where I'm going with this?
Yep, it's,
Dr. Bob, do you
yeah.
know where I'm going with
Yeah,
this?
so well, let me welcome in Forrest, and we figured out how to say his name. It's like spaghetti, right? It's Forrest Maready, right?
But you're not supposed to say
Very
that.
good.
Maready, yeah. Well, no, but that's
guys
how
are
people
quick
know,
learners.
Yeah, Forrest Maready, and he's the author of more than one book. But today we're talking about The Moth in the Iron Lung. It's a biography of polio. So welcome,
Yeah.
Forrest. Yeah.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. Huge fan, long-time listener, first-time caller.
All right.
Tell us the truth. Honestly, Forrest, tell us the truth. Have you listened to this podcast before? I won't be offended
I
if you
have
say
not.
No. Oh,
sorry.
and that's the end of our call. Thank you, Forrest. And take care.
But I think, we'll see if we scare him away from listening to our podcast or if we attract him to want to come back
Forrest,
and hear more.
come on. Join the tribe. Join the tribe of the Vaccine Conversation podcasters. You got to listen.
I'm going to.
Okay, it's going to be.
I've already got the T-shirt on the way.
Yeah. Yes. So this book, I originally came across because I've been doing a lot of reading on lots of topics on this, but I found this book on Amazon originally, and I ordered it because I thought this was really interesting. The reviews were good, and I wanted to know more about polio. I have not personally done my very extensive research on that disease. I've done a lot on measles because we've been talking about it, but not polio. And I will admit, polio is one of those ones that you say, well, everybody brings up that argument, and where do you go from there? Because everybody goes, what do you want to have the iron lung back, and where do you go from there? And so this I thought was really interesting because it provides this historical context to perhaps what might have been the real origin of the paralytic polio, which is different than just the intestinal virus. And it gave a lot of information. And before we get into it, maybe I'll just ask you, Forrest, what led you to want to kind of go researching polio?
Yeah, it was just initially curiosity. There were things, as I started to research it, much like you probably have, there was a couple of things about the story that just didn't line up. My spidey senses were tingling a little bit. And I felt like, it's kind of when you get into fourth grade and you learn that Christopher Columbus discovered America, and I'm air quoting, discovered America, and he made friends with the natives and everyone, lived happily ever after. And then you get into high school and college and you start realizing that maybe that story wasn't exactly the way it happened. The same thing happened with polio as I began to research it. I started, twisting my head a little bit, saying, well, this doesn't line up, and this doesn't make sense. There's some things about it that don't quite jive with me. So I started researching it, and the more I researched it, the more fascinated I became with the story. And eventually, I found a thread, a narrative that I felt like, wow, this might actually make a good book. And not just a historical account, but an actual narrative tale that can explain what actually happened, which, as it turns out, is quite a bit different than the stories we were told in third and fourth and fifth grade.
And so what would you say is the story everyone's been told about polio?
Yeah, it was a disease that always existed, and it got really bad for reasons we don't understand in the 1900s. And then we started building iron lungs to save people, and nobody knew what to do. And then a vaccine was developed in the 1950s, and polio instantly disappeared as we know it, and we've never had to worry about it again. The reality is much different.
Yeah, so, Dr. Bob, tell me what in medical school you're learning about infectious diseases, the history of this, or even growing up, since you're a bit older than I am. No, just kidding. What would you say was your idea of what polio was in the story of polio?
No, it's pretty much that. And yes, people were dying left and right and being paralyzed, and iron lung machines were, lined up by the thousands all over the country. And then yes, this vaccine came along and has allowed us to eliminate the disease, from not only our country, but from the majority of the world. And it really is used as the quintessential example of vaccine success and how good a vaccine can be and how needed vaccines are. And I was very, very fascinated by reading this book because it kind of helped open my eyes that maybe some of that is partly true, but some of that might not be true. And this might be an example of maybe a vaccine that did help in some ways, maybe did play a role in maybe helping us get rid of the poliovirus in some ways. But there's so much more to the story that we're finding out that it almost becomes an example of the complicated nature of the just how pharma and the government and public fear and disease and PR campaigns and companies that make potentially toxic products, and how that all intermingles, how we just talked about maybe in our last episode, how you have to use PR to help sell an idea and get the public to believe an idea, and how that then turns into like a certain success story, that then people 100 years later will buy that story and believe that story and continue the narrative because they don't really understand what happened 100 years ago. So that's
and not just one success story, but it's the foundation of the mass vaccination program, essentially, because once that narrative did come out, then it was every vaccine now should be, approached the same way and have that same like infallibility. Because polio is kind of like, even though there had already been the DTP vaccine earlier than that, and obviously smallpox, technically it wasn't until that mass polio vaccination where people were like, oh my God, now let's add the list of all the different things we need to also, quote unquote, eradicate, through modern medicine. But I'll say for me, I had not done a lot of research on polio, but I was under the impression, I was under the impression that it was always paralytic. Because this is kind of what we're told, right? That if you get polio, you are going to be paralyzed and potentially die. And that it was happening, like you're saying, left and right, hundreds of thousands, almost everybody until the vaccine came along. I was really interested to learn that it was a virus, an intestinal virus that had existed before. And this concept of an environmental trigger, basically, creating the opening for this to cause more damage as it relates to the spinal column, in this case, the permeating of the gut, which we know now with modern research. We know that the permeation of the gut is very risky for a lot of people and can cause all sorts of different problems. And that at this time, obviously in the 50s and 60s, no one was really talking about that. Right. But the idea that an intestinal virus always was there, but because of some other exposure that you had, some third-party exposure, that's what made the difference on whether or not it took over your body, created complications, and possibly paralysis or death. That's the part of the theory that I think most people have never heard or aren't aware of, that there is, I think, a great plausibility, because why would it just all of a sudden turn into paralytic, and why in only certain situations, and why did it just disappear? But the poliovirus was not... like we talked about this with Dr. Thomas Cowan, how the polio virus was not even in a huge subset of people that were paralyzed at a time in, I think it was New York, right? And or Chicago. It wasn't even half of the people tested negative for poliovirus, but they had the symptoms. And so you think to yourself, well, then how could that coincide if it's not always present? This also kind of Well, Forrest, I want to there's so much to talk about with this book, but why don't you give us, if you can give us like the 1-minute version of kind of the theory that this book brings forth, and then we'll break it down. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, you guys touched on it really, really well. I'm very impressed with your knowledge from the book. But I'll just say this.
Did you hear that, Melissa? He's impressed with my knowledge too, not just yours.
Well, yeah.
Anyway, so go ahead.
The biggest takeaway that when people hear polio and think I'm upsetting their version of the story, this is the thing you need to know. There are several enteroviruses that are innocuous, self-limiting infections that have been with humanity for thousands of years. And for some reason, in the late 1800s, all of these enteroviruses gained the ability to paralyze. Poliovirus just happens to be one of them. Mm-hmm. Poliovirus is the one they focused on. But people need to understand, anytime you hear Aunt Martha had polio when she was 4 years old, if this was in the 1950s, they didn't know what paralyzed her. It could have been one of several different enteroviruses. And so, to summarize, all enteroviruses that are capable of paralysis in certain situations began doing this in the late 1800s alongside the introduction of a specific pesticide called lead arsenate. And this pesticide was introduced in northeastern United States to combat an invasive species of moth called the gypsy moth. And you can, in fact, trace the spread of the initial epidemic forms of polio And when I say polio, I'm talking about paralysis from any of these enteroviruses, because that's actually what it used to refer to. You can trace the spread of epidemic polio along the lines of that gypsy moth. As they tried to combat the spread of the gypsy moth, you can follow the spread of epidemic polio in lockstep. So that's sort of the summary.
I was just going to say, so for people who are not, aware of this because they haven't read this yet, can you just briefly explain for them, in parts of the United States, people were getting, they were having these infestations of particular moths that were coming through and destroying the trees, because they were that was their food, and the towns basically were really freaked out about this and how can we combat this? And they were trying different pesticides, different sprays and things to try to deter this moth from coming. And it was happening, cycling every year or just at a certain period of time.
Yep, that's right. Once a year.
And go ahead.
Basically, this gypsy moth was brought over by a Frenchman. He was experimenting with ways to create better ways of creating silk. The moth escaped from his home, and as often happens with different invasive species, it exploded and started destroying this town called Medford, Massachusetts, which is right outside of Boston. And at the time, the only pesticide that was really effective was called Paris green, and it was basically a form of arsenic. And interestingly, this is one of the big papers that I discovered in my research for the book. Someone discovered that if you purposely poisoned animals with Paris green, they would develop what they called poliomyelitis, which is what we call polio. So we have scientific proof in the late 1800s that scientists understood that if they gave massive doses of a pesticide to animals, they would develop polio. Now, whether that's acute poisoning from the pesticide itself or because it gave them the permeability in their gut to allow normally innocuous enteroviruses to get into their nervous system, we don't know. But regardless, this moth presented a problem because it was so voracious and was destroying all the beautiful hardwoods of New England. And so in 1892, they figured out if they could combine arsenic and lead together, they formed this pesticide called lead arsenate. And it was really popular because it stuck to the leaves, it stuck to the produce, to the fruit, to the apples that were so popular up there. And you couldn't wash it off. Now, that may sound like a good thing from a farmer's perspective, but from a mother's perspective, it's not a very good thing.
I know, that's making me uncomfortable just talking about it, actually.
I think just if we fast forward briefly to today, we're finding arsenic is very prevalent in the ground, in the soil, in the groundwater, and it's soaked up by certain crops, especially rice. Rice really absorbs arsenic, and so we're seeing arsenic in rice products, baby food with rice, infant formula. I mean, it's a very considerable problem.
And then, of course, lead was always found to be dangerous back in 60s and 70s.
Right. I know, and lead is like every pediatrician's nightmare is lead poisoning, and this all stems back,
and just combining
from these
those two together,
things.
spraying on food or nearby your house in your area where children are playing and stuff. Obviously, just looks like a recipe for disaster.
Right. And I think, go ahead, Forrest.
You hear of neighborhoods that have to basically rehabilitate their entire top layer of soil because they were built on apple orchards, and the lead arsenate problem is so severe. People are either going to abandon the neighborhood unless they don't rehabilitate the soil. So it's a horrible problem that exists to this day. Even though they don't use it anymore, it still is a problem.
Well, and to clarify for anybody, if you're wondering how these terms polio and poliomyelitis are used, I just want to clarify because not everybody knows all of this, but people, like Forrest is saying, people use the word polio to describe paralytic polio, which is poliomyelitis. But polio is supposed to represent the poliovirus, which is, like he's saying, is an intestinal virus. So these terms got used interchangeably, which is what probably led to a lot of the mass hysteria, is because if you hear the word polio, even though it could be a harmless virus that is going through your gut and out of your body, passing like a cold, essentially, it's not always going to be paralyzing, but because the country started using the word polio to describe anything that was paralyzing, that those two terms have kind of gotten confused. So poliomyelitis is the paralytic polio. Polio is really supposed to just represent an intestinal virus, the poliovirus, just an actual virus that doesn't necessarily have to mean complications or anything dangerous other than one of the other thousands of enteroviruses like Forrest mentioned.
Yeah, Forrest, I want to ask, as I read through the book and I saw all your sources, I was very fascinated. And can you just basically touch on what you read, where you found these sources, can other people find these resources? Where did you get all your information from?
Yeah, there's a lot of really good, they call them monographs, which aren't quite books and are bigger than studies. These are 15 to 20 page reports that government agencies used to put out. They're infinitely readable. They're very easy for someone to understand who doesn't have, super in-depth scientific knowledge. But there's been several books on polio. The history of poliomyelitis is probably considered the Bible of anyone trying to study polio. There's been some interesting Polio, An American Story by David Oshinsky is actually a really good book. He has some conclusions from that I disagree with, but I sent him my book in hopes that he would read it and so that we could have a dialogue. But his book won a Pulitzer Prize. So there's a lot of good, interesting polio books out there. None of them, in my mind, cover why did it happen? Why did epidemic polio suddenly appear in the late 1800s when, if you look through medical history, you will only see just little sprinklings of it, one here, two there, every 20 years, every 30 years, you might see a case that resembles it. And eventually, like I said, in the 1890s, it started to explode. And that was one of the biggest mysteries that anyone who was studying it struggled with, is why all of a sudden is it happening so frequently when it had never been a problem before? And unfortunately, like I said, it's pretty clear to me that this lead arsenate pesticide was basically, as Melissa said, was sort of the third component that took what was an innocuous enteroviral infection in the gut and gave it the ability to get into the nervous system and cause problems.
And I'm going to read a portion of your book that's coincidentally exactly what I was just about to read was what you were just talking about. So this works out perfectly. So one of the things you say in the intro, and I'm going to quote this from the book, you say, throughout human history, the body appeared suitably equipped to handle poliovirus infections. Its presence was more likely to create immunity than paralysis or any other problem. Something changed, starting in the late 1800s, which turned this once harmless infection into a frequent killer. The story of what caused this formerly trivial virus to transform into a monster is as important as what seemed to tame it. Of course, talking about the vaccine. The story of polio before the vaccine may be the most important part, specifically because of the nature of what may have created the problem in the first place. And I agree with you that the fact that we're talking about the disease is not enough. You want to know the why, not just so that you can understand more of the historical perspective, but so that you can prevent these kind of things from happening again. Because if you're worried just on the virus and you're forgetting about these possible third-party exposures, and we still have some of those exposures in different forms in today's society, then we're setting ourselves up for potential damage again. And understanding the why, in my opinion, is crucial to being able to understand how our body functions on that using allopathic medicine and natural medicine, how the body works, what we really need to treat and what we need to look out for. You have to have that deep understanding, and the why to me is perhaps the most important part.
Yeah, I like that, and I want to weigh in just so people do know that even the mainstream medical community has always known that 99 point something percent of people who get poliovirus into their body, into their intestines, it's harmless to over 99% of us. And we might get a little fever, a little diarrhea, we might feel mildly sick, and then we get over it and we develop immunity. And that's even polio today. Polio 100 years ago, as long as this poliovirus has been around, it's been harmless to virtually everybody. And then they figured out that some very small number, less than 1%, somehow will become paralyzed from that virus and develop what you know of as paralytic polio, and that's what everyone's afraid of. But in general, the virus originally, for many centuries, has been, millennia even, has been totally innocuous and harmless. So I think what Forrest brings up is the why. Why did this virus change, or why did it develop the ability to suddenly paralyze a very, very tiny percentage of the population? And basically kind of what Forrest is saying is you can actually correlate the introduction of the arsenic Paris green insecticide, and then the lead arsenate insecticide. And you can also basically when all the farmers started using those, that's when we saw outbreaks of paralysis occurring, small outbreaks, but only in rural areas, only in farming areas, not in the cities. And the outbreaks were very small and very well contained, but directly related to where they were now using this insecticide to try to control the moths. And then we started, decades later, we started seeing outbreaks in cities like New York, where they had started spraying everywhere, spraying not so much lead arsenate, but using DDT, spraying DDT everywhere. Parents started treating their sick kids with mercury medications. And that's when we started seeing this kind of correlation between outbreaks of paralytic polio now, completely associated with the timing of when we started using all these other chemicals. And I think the point being, we're not saying that polio can't paralyze you, or we're not saying that the poliovirus doesn't exist at all. I think we now know it exists, and we know it does paralyze some people. I think that the take-home points are, it seems to have started paralyzing people because of the environmental toxins we were using. And that was destroying people's guts, creating, basically leaky gut, destroying gut impermeability, allowing the virus to then invade into the body, invade through, when people had their tonsils removed, invading that way, and basically setting up the ability for the poliovirus to cause paralysis in a minority of people, where still the majority of people that caught the disease were still not harmed at all. But, Forrest's other point is there are several other enteroviruses that can do the same thing. It wasn't only polio. We have no vaccine for those enteroviruses. We never made one. And we even have that enterovirus today. You hear about the polio-like virus today in California.
AFM.
Yeah, that's causing AFM. That's an enterovirus probably, but why now? Why is that suddenly hitting in certain areas, especially I think largely some rural areas? Again, it might be due to environmental toxins we're now introducing and still using today. So I think that's kind of what I think the gist of the book is, and again to not discount that polio exists, because it does. I think Forrest is just saying there's so much more to the story. And I like what you're saying, Melissa. What can we learn from this? We need to learn that there's so much more we need to do with our bodies and our health when it comes to natural living and trying to avoid all these toxins. It's not just go out and get all your vaccines, because that's not always going to be what protects you. It's bigger than that. Sorry, that's my rant for the day. But,
and I
just want to go back and address, Melissa, your point real quick about what can we learn from this. This is really important that we understand this as humanitarians who care for each other and want to lessen the suffering of others. We need to understand this because in countries that still have paralytic problems, a polio vaccine alone will never solve the issue. If you look at countries that still have very toxic levels of pesticide use, such as India or China, where DDT is still legal, you will see the polio vaccine, the oral polio vaccine, has positively affected the outbreaks of polio there in some way. The problem is, it's like playing whack-a-mole. Other enteroviruses have now become the paralyzing agent. And if you look at the graphs, you'll see acute flaccid myelitis, which is basically polio by another name, by another virus. As poliovirus paralysis has gone down, acute flaccid myelitis, which is polio by some other enterovirus, has gone up to take its place.
And that's because they still have that third party.
There's not enough vaccines on the planet to solve this problem. You need to clean up their environment. This is what happened to the United States. In 1952, that was the peak of DDT use. Lead arsenate had already fallen by the wayside, and parents, mothers in particular, became really concerned that DDT was toxic. And the reason they thought that is because DDT was being sprayed directly on children. DDT wasn't just a food pesticide.
Right.
It was like you might spray off or cutter on your kids when they're going camping. They would coat their kids in DDT to protect them from flies because they thought flies were spreading the polio.
Right, or mosquitoes.
So in the ultimate irony, they were literally increasing their kids' chance of picking up a dangerous paralytic enteroviral infection by coating them in DDT. And like I said, in 1952, that was the peak of DDT usage. And you can see it in Life magazine. You'll start to see ads appear that say DDT free. It's like the first year
I remember
you
that.
see that. And these Life magazine ads are a real good canary in the coal mine. I mean, they tell you that parents were beginning to become concerned about DDT. And so as soon as DDT usage starts to fall, polio starts to fall in lockstep.
Right.
Now,
yeah.
the vaccine, the initial injected polio vaccine, what's called the Salk vaccine, was first rolled out in 1955. You've heard of the Cutter incident where there was some manufacturing errors that ended up killing a few people, paralyzing a bunch more. So they pulled it off the shelves and then reintroduced it a year or two later, about 1956, 57. And polio had already, like I said, in 1952, it had already started going down. And so the Salk vaccine was never really a good vaccine, and doctors admitted this. They knew the injected vaccine didn't work very well, and they didn't understand why. And if I could just use an example, in 1960, there was a study in Detroit where they took the stool samples of about 1,000 people that had come down with polio, and I'm quoting polio in the air because remember, it can be caused by a variety of viruses. So in that test, they did stool samples, and only 1/3 of the people that had been diagnosed with polio actually had polioviral infections. The other 2/3 were infected by some other enterovirus. So that answered their question, why was the injected Salk vaccine not working very well? And the reason is because these people weren't getting sick or paralyzed from the poliovirus at all. They were getting paralyzed from something else.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
So as we move forward and try to help, like you think about India and Pakistan, where some of these paralytic cases are so horrible, like I said, there are not enough vaccines on the planet to stop this problem because there are, we have poliovirus, we have Coxsackie virus, echovirus, D68, and there's new enteroviruses being discovered all the time, which in the right conditions are capable of causing paralysis. So rather than trying to develop 1 million vaccines to take care of the problem, why don't we focus on cleaning up their environment, healing their guts, and making it so these enteroviral infections are once again innocuous like they used to be.
Right, like they don't have the conditions.
Right.
And to quote and to A couple of things I wanted to mention. So covering what you cover in the book, some of the conditions, these third-party triggers or these environmental toxins include herbicides, pesticides, like Dr. Bob was saying, this mercurial teething gels that they were using, some arsenic medicines even that were given at the late 1800s through the early 1900s. There were different things that were prescribed that created a toxicity. And that for some people, the symptoms that they had were actually more of poisoning, like this lead poisoning, arsenic poisoning, or mercury poisoning. So these metals were basically causing this permeation in the gut and then causing the other things. And one thing I find really interesting that you mentioned was the plausibility of the location of the spinal column and why it only caused paralysis to the extremities and oftentimes not the arms, but just the legs, and how these young children, because this was an infantile paralytic syndrome, that these young children, the positioning of where their intestines were next to their spinal column at that young age made it so that where it was permeated would be the lower part of the spinal column, and it would not be traveling all the way up to make somebody completely paralyzed the way we think of today, but it would only be paralyzing at these lower extremities. And I thought that was a really interesting point that came up, and why we started to see this type of paralysis, and why with this age group again, it's a theory, but it's a very plausible theory, and it's not like we could go back and know for sure, something 70 years ago. But the point is that all of these other things that you're bringing to the table here really, like you said originally, show that there is a bigger story to this polio in general than what we've been told, like a lot of other things in history. And like what's happening with the grander vaccine debate, a lot of what we are told is not the whole story, which is the entire reason we have this podcast, is to aim to show the other story of it so that you can see both sides and make your critical thinking, educated and informed opinions about this. But if we're only told one side of things, then we only believe one side of things. And so what you're saying about today's conditions, we need to know, are they still spraying things? Are there other types of things that are accessing the body in a way that make the conditions such that an intestinal virus could be, that could paralyze them for life or create complications, potentially even fatal? It's not just the virus to be worried about, and it's not just the vaccine as the solution. We have to look at all of the other components, just like anything else. It's the whole body approach and the whole body approach to health for our society. And so this idea that if you're not vaccinating your children fully with the CDC schedule, you are not helping the health of our society, and you are making our society diseased and sick. It's like, if you understand exactly how health works, you understand it's not just about the vaccine. The vaccines don't always work. They don't always last. They might not be for the right virus, like what Forrest is saying. We cannot be dependent on medicine as our Band-Aid for health, because health has to be, in so many different ways, and it does involve the environment. And we have to become experts on that, because that's how we safeguard our children from all the other things that we don't have vaccines for that could, have devastating effects. So what's nice about this book and the idea that you're bringing this to the table is that it's not just about polio. It is about this, how we look at health as a society, and this idea of mandating things for people for the idea of public health, how it doesn't make sense, because it's not going to solve the problem. It is not going to solve the outbreaks. We know with measles, it's not going to, 100% compliance is not going to stop measles outbreaks. People need to look at the bigger story. And so I really appreciate that by you digging deeper on this, you're actually raising awareness on how we need to approach health in general. And why that's so important. And that's what the ethical responsibility should be from person to person, to be able to take care of and support and care about one another. That's what we should be looking at.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Agree?
In the 1950s, when scientists were racing to come up with a vaccine for this, was a very important time in medical history, because all of these scientists and around the world, organizations had money to spend, and they were trying to understand why these children were being paralyzed. And it was a time of optimism. It was a time of hope. It was a time of genuine compassion. And the problem is, we project some of our anger about maybe some of the more difficult parts of the vaccine discussion onto polio. And the reality is, back then, they didn't know what caused it. They didn't understand it. They were doing the best they could. There was no attempt to bamboozle anyone. They weren't trying to harm anyone. They were legitimately freaked out. This was like a real effort to save children from becoming paralyzed. So there is no anger. I have no anger or animosity toward any of these scientists. In fact, I have a lot of respect for them in some ways. The problem is, through the lens, through the clarity that comes through the passing of time, we need to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff and see where we went wrong.
Right.
And the reality is, we went wrong when we couldn't allow ourselves to accept the possibility that paralytic polio is actually a man-made problem. It is not a random occurrence that happened through some genetic shift, but it was literally something we did. It was our fault. And most people cannot face that reality.
You hear a lot of people that talk about, my family member was hurt or affected by polio. And in my family, it was my mother-in-law. And they think that there is a lack of compassion by the parents today that are not willing to sign up for the 69 doses on the CDC schedule. Of course, they're unaware that there are 69 doses now, and this doesn't look like the schedule from 1952 or 1954. But also they feel like there's a lack of compassion. And I exactly what I wrote this down on the paper before you said that, but what you're saying is people were genuinely trying to help. We should be angry, but we should not be angry at the wrong people. And what we should be angry at is the fact that there were actual things that were responsible for this.
Right.
And there were components, chemicals. There were things introduced. So the person that was paralyzed by polio in the 1950s, that is awful that happened to you. But that didn't happen to you because people refused to get the vaccine or because there are people who want to question components that are in a vaccine. It happened because there was this additional toxin that was introduced into the body. And that's where we should be angry. That's where we should be upset about polio. And it should not become the argument of why every single person has this community responsibility to save people from getting hurt again, because they're using it that way. But the truth is, it's not anybody else's fault that people were getting paralyzed. The fault comes down to these products that were introduced.
Yeah, and Forrest, I love how you go into a lot of detail about the chemicals, the herbicides, the pesticides, the lead arsenate, and especially the DDT, and you go through. Basically, you paint a picture that we can almost parallel today, maybe with glyphosate or all kinds of other environmental toxins. You basically show how they started using DDT and how that directly correlated with outbreaks and worsening of a variety of paralytic diseases. And then you point how parents started questioning the safety of DDT. Started crying out for help, and how certain scientists started saying, well, yeah, maybe DDT is not safe. Maybe it is a toxin. And then I love how you show how then the PR and media campaign launched about trying to show how safe DDT was and how they did safety research and they hired scientists to air quotes, prove how safe DDT was and how to reassure the public. And then they started, had to fund government officials so the government officials could start saying how safe DDT was. And the government safety oversight organizations would not come down on DDT, and how they basically had to continue using it for such a long time after people started calling foul, started crying out for help. This is harming our children. But they had to keep using it for, I don't know how many years they keep using it for after they realized that, it was dangerous. And then eventually they decided, oh, yep, it looks like it is dangerous. We're going to ban it in the United States.
And then they became the heroes for banning it.
Yes.
Isn't that ironic?
Yeah, and how much is that parallel to today? The exact kind of vaccine conversation that we have with people today. And so I thank you for going through all that in the books. I think that really does shed light on why we need to be smarter with our health and smarter about what we're being told, because we're not always being told the truth.
And what's great is in the book, each chapter is basically a different small outbreak or larger outbreak based on city, based on year. And the way that he breaks down the book is kind of interesting. So you can sort of follow the chronological movement of as this went from the rural cases and how it was starting to see the pattern of always summertime and how now all of a sudden it was moving into the cities. And so it's kind of neat the way that he does the book. Like he said, there's a narrative there as well, which is kind of interesting, like with the original caterpillar of the gypsy moth. That was kind of interesting as he tells the story of that. But you can go into detail with each individual outbreak and circumstance and follow this along in the book, which I thought was a really unique way to do so much historical data, kind of, because it's really hard to keep it all follow along with all of it unless you had it separated the way that you did. So I thought that was
that was
nice.
very well done. But I also want to say, as your resources, you mentioned some of your resources, but I love how you have all kinds of resources, like from like the Journal of the American Medical Association, from the late 1800s, and like there's a New York Times, and there's lots of other medical journals. There's actually, as we do today, there are published medical journals that are available even from way back then that talk about the cases and the science behind the cases, and news reports, all kinds of articles about the pesticides they're using and the worries about that. So, you're not just making all this up. I mean, your book is really, I think, well put together, very well sourced, and going back to the original sources, like we would love
language.
To have. That as just as a true researcher would be presenting this kind of information.
Well, I appreciate it. There's definitely plenty of information out there that supports what I'm saying in the book, and I'm not the first to say it. I'm definitely, as far as I know, the first to suggest that children were paralyzed in their legs because of the proximity of their spinal cord to their intestinal tract, and that the other pesticides were creating permeability issues. Because anytime you mention pesticides, naysayers will say, well, that's not what pesticide paralysis looks like. And my point is, well, I'm not talking about paralysis from DDT or from lead arsenate.
Right.
I'm talking about, like you said, Melissa, in the very beginning, the pesticides creating a channel through which
pathway.
These innocuous enteroviruses can get into the spinal cord.
Yeah.
But yes, this is not crazy tinfoil hat theory stuff. This is all thoroughly supported by scientific and medical literature. The problem is not data. The problem is not the historical record. The problem is humanity and pride. And it's going to take a very long time for humans to accept that we did this to our children.
You know what? You're so right. And I wrote that down, that we can't worry about protecting the narrative. Like at this point, we cannot worry about protecting the heroic story as it relates to this. What we have to do is tell the truth. And for many cases in history, that's too difficult for people to swallow. And that's kind of where we are now. They're so concerned with protecting the program that they are unwilling to admit children are being injured. And so, the thousands of people that show up at the Capitol saying my child has had a vaccine reaction, they are literally trying to pretend those kids don't exist, but yet you see them by the thousands. So we know it's happening, and yet the medical establishment refuses to acknowledge them. And they're so concerned with protecting the narrative.
Right.
But we as a society have an ethical responsibility to find a solution. And we have an ethical responsibility to acknowledge and protect these disabled children and disabled people that are as a result of something that had all intents and purposes good intentions. We know that the intention was not to hurt people, but that doesn't matter because people are still being hurt. So we cannot be afraid to look down on the narrative or tell a different story, because what we have to be conscious of is making sure we're telling the truth. Whether or not that paints the picture you want or not doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Like, I don't care about somebody's pride and ego at this point. We care about protecting people.
Yeah, and I like one of the truths in the book that really spoke to me was how you presented all the different types of symptoms people would have from the whole different variety of causes of paralysis. And we know that you describe how if you have like the classic poliovirus related poliomyelitis, that has like a really distinct process where you get a little fever, a little intestinal symptoms, and then you have the ascending paralysis where you develop weakness in your legs, and it's a very known set of symptoms. But the paralysis and the symptoms you get from the poisonings types of paralysis, where we think the actual DDT or the lead arsenic cause your paralysis, that has kind of a whole different set of symptoms, and then but still ends in some neuromuscular damage, and then
they didn't know that back then,
right.
We know that now.
Right, we know that now. So people kind of all thought, well, it's got to be just all the same thing. It's got to be one virus, and then some of the other enteroviruses cause different symptoms, and one of the symptoms that varies from the classic poliovirus is the pain, like the hypersensitivity, where you get touched and you're really averse to touch, and touch is really painful for you, and then you have all kinds of terrible pains in your legs,
like a nerve thing.
Nerve injury. Mm-hmm. That's not classic poliovirus type of paralysis, and we know that's more evidence that there was all kinds of different causes of this, because only a very small subset had the classic poliovirus type of symptoms. And the most famous case of poliovirus people always talk to is FDR. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the person, one that became our president. He developed these paralytic symptoms as a young adult, but not in the classic poliovirus way.
Right?
He had severe pain, and he had hypersensitivity, and the way he got sick was totally different than the classic poliovirus. So it's funny how, well, it's not funny, it's very interesting how the narrative is that we know FDR caught the poliovirus and became permanently, disabled from it. We absolutely don't know that. Mm-hmm. We know he had a form of, nerve injury that looked very different than the classic symptoms of poliovirus, and his situation mimicked more either other enteroviruses or chemical poisoning, and he was affected, yet he kind of became the poster person for the success,
mm-hmm.
how we got rid of poliovirus. So I appreciate how you presented that, and not to discount how severe FDR's experience was, but we don't know.
What
we don't know it was the actual virus, because they could never determine that, and his symptoms were different, as many people's symptoms were different than classic poliovirus.
And just to read another portion of your book that is saying what you're saying right now, as it relates to this third-party access, I just want to throw in a few more quotes here. You said it is, and I wrote this when I was reading this, I wrote bingo on this little line right here. I put a star, I put bingo. You said it is possible that an interaction between ingested metals and an enterovirus infection offers a mechanism by which many formerly trivial viruses were able to reach the central nervous system. In the intestine of someone with few pesticides or metals, an enterovirus infection might appear like a common cold. You continue, but in a child whose spinal cord was directed against their intestines, mercuric teething powders or lead arsenate might combine with a simultaneous enterovirus infection to create the perfect opportunity for an otherwise innocuous virus to do serious damage. And you said in a gut compromised from chronic metal or pesticide toxicity, many of the enteroviruses that infect millions of people each day may gain the ability to cross over into the nervous system and create the lesions of poliomyelitis. Mm-hmm. You said it turns out that the poliovirus may have been responsible for some of the paralysis, but it did not act alone. It needed help from something capable of disrupting the normal protective function of the intestinal immune system. Mm-hmm. And I think all of that is so key and really summarizes what you are saying here. Which is not that the vaccine didn't do any good or that the virus didn't exist or that people that had polio were exaggerating. Obviously, you're not saying any of those things. You're saying this was a terrible tragedy, but we're looking in the wrong place for the source of what caused it and what made it bad for some people and not for others. And then once you know that, that's how you understand how it went away or if it went away or how it, how this has changed.
Yeah, the DDT causes cell membrane dysfunction. This is something that's known. I'm not making this up. My hypothesis is that is how enteroviruses and why the geographic proximity of a infant spinal cord to the intestine is key to understanding why these enterovirus infections seem to start in the legs and ascend upwards, as Bob said. If you go to the CDC website or any standard explanation of the way a polio infection causes paralysis, they'll say, for reasons we don't understand, the poliovirus gets into the bloodstream, and for reasons we don't understand, seems to affect the bottom of the spinal cord. And that was one of the initial head scratchers that got me started researching this, was because I couldn't understand why were children being affected and why was it their legs? If it was getting into their blood, the spinal cord is served by several vessels, and there's no logical reason why it would affect the bottom of the spinal cord so prevalently, and in fact, no reason it would affect the front of the spinal cord, as you guys were talking about, where normal poliovirus infection paralysis is thought of as just paralysis, nothing on the back of the spinal cord. The back of the spinal cord is where the neurons and axons that control touch and sensitivity run. On the front is the motor side, and that's why I believe the geographic proximity of the gut to the front and bottom of the spinal cord is why people got paralysis in their legs, and not numbness, not pain and sensitivity. But
right.
Yeah, it's not out of left field. If people haven't studied pesticides, just know that we know pesticides cause cell membrane dysfunction, and in fact, that's the way they kill. That's why they work, on bees and other, insects. They get into their legs and get in there, and they start basically disrupting cells.
Yeah, I love how you talk about the classic picture of polio and the iron lung machines. In the auditorium at Rancho Los Amigos Hospital in Los Angeles, the picture taken in 1953. And I didn't know this, and so I really appreciated this book brought to light. The picture where there's 20 or 30 iron lung machines all lined up, and in a room, and the nurses are attending them, and their patients are all in these iron lung machines. So I was always under the assumption that nationwide, every single hospital had a huge room full of hundreds of iron lung machines, and they were there, and just hundreds of people were inside these machines on any given day. And what's interesting is that historically, we now know that hospitals maybe had 1 or 2 iron lung machines. They might have had 10 if they were lucky. And they only had, and this picture was taken because a bunch of iron lung machines were shipped to the Los Angeles area. They put them all together in this one room. They put some patients in it, but they probably had just some volunteers to lie in the machines because they didn't have enough patients. They took this staged photograph. This was not a real medical setting, I think is what you're saying. They took the staged photograph so they could capture this moment in history. And then they sent all these iron lung machines off to the various hospitals. And the reality was there never were these huge wards full of hundreds and hundreds of people lined up. And not to discount how important these iron lung machines were, because they saved a lot of lives, but it wasn't what people thought it was. And people have a fear of returning to this day, this era of being in one of these machines lined up in a warehouse somewhere. It never happened, but that's the narrative historically they want us to say. So I appreciate that you were able to track that down and clear that up.
Yeah, that picture is the picture. In the entire vaccine debate discussion of infectious disease and humanity, that picture is the quintessential picture of misunderstanding and the hope of mankind to heal that which we have inadvertently created ourselves.
Exactly.
Right.
So the reality of this is there were never that many iron lungs in use. I think from my estimates, there were about 1,100 in the entire country. Los Angeles and Boston were the biggest polio wards in the entire country. And I think Los Angeles at its peak had 11 and Boston had 8.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, I've got a picture of the Boston polio ward, which was the second biggest polio ward in the country, and it had 8. And I counted in the picture I can find of the Ranchos Los Amigos Hospital, in their actual polio ward, there were 11 in the picture I could count. So, yeah, this photo was used to comfort parents. It was a publicity photo, just like you might have a military parade to convince people nobody's going to hurt us. And look at all our tanks and our shiny, nuclear missiles. This was the same thing. It was an attempt to assuage the fears of nervous parents that we weren't ready to handle polio.
Like we've got it under control. Now, we're here.
And this is the problem: is any critique of this story makes people feel that you're not sympathetic to what was going on, and I'm not. This is a horrible situation. Polio was a horrible situation. The reality is there were other diseases that were killing far more children than polio, and the reality is there weren't that many iron lungs. There were very few of them, and this photo was staged in a honest, well-intentioned move to comfort parents who were worried about their children. But the reality of what was going on is this picture does not represent what was going on in the country. This was a staged photo, and even a large town like Chicago may have only had 2 or 3. Thankfully, they weren't needed. Paralysis from polio was, breathing problems from paralysis was very rare. You remember, it started in the lower part of your spinal cord most often, and it would ascend upwards. So it had to make it all the way through your legs, your stomach, your abdomen. It had to make it all the way up into the part of your spinal cord that controls the intercostal muscles and diaphragm that allow you to expand your lungs. So that was rare for it to make it that far. Normally, your immune system could get on top of the infection by the time it made it that far.
Right.
So it was a very, when you say less than 1% are paralyzed by polio, far, far fewer than that actually got paralyzed to the point where an iron lung was necessary.
Okay. All right. Well, this has been wonderful. This really taught me a lot. But speaking with you, Forrest, I really appreciate hearing a lot more from you. Just kind of your intention of the book and how you definitely don't want to discount poliovirus and the scientists that worked so hard and tirelessly to develop a vaccine and all the good intentions. But yeah, I think this is a very, very well written. And if you will permit me to read the last paragraph of the book,
sure thing.
I think it really sums up a lot of this. It's basically the audacious tale of how the polio vaccine saved us from harm is so ingrained into cultural lore, it feels wrong to dispute it. Indeed, many are attacked for daring to question a single detail. Because of this, the story has lived on, unsullied by those who would seek to find the truth, no matter the courage or cowardice it reveals. Perhaps the unvarnished account of polio will one day come to light and will rightly take its place in history as a portent of the arrogance of man, a change which would be most welcome. Humans will continue to prefer the heroic journey, and there are far more deserving stories to tell. So, anyway.
That's good. You should have done my audiobook.
I was going to say, I was actually just going to ask, do you have an audio book of this available?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Oh, nice. I'm going to get that from my dad.
Audiobook.
Yeah, so it's it's The Moth and the Iron Lung by Forrest Maready.
But if you're Italian, it'd be like Forrest Maready, spaghetti. But if you're Irish, it'd be Forrest Maready. Forrest Maready.
As you say it.
Hey, Forrest, where can people find you, like on social media or online?
Or do you want them to find you? I always say that. Do you want them?
No. I'm not. The books are currently on Amazon because I run counter to the story that most people would prefer to hear. There's always the chance my books may get taken down from there. They're currently on Amazon, and they are currently also on my store through my website, which is forrestmaready.com, and that's Forrest with 2 R's, and Maready is Maready. you can Google my name and probably get to my website.
This book is called The Moth in the Iron Lung. I don't know if we actually were really good about the title earlier on, but just to confirm, this is called The Moth in the Iron Lung, to say it again. And it's definitely worth a read, definitely for people who like to go a little deeper.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you could go find some of this research and go look for yourself. This is not to, make you believe something. It's to make you think about the possibility of something. That's what we do, is we're always trying to open your mind to the possibility of another story being there. Mm-hmm. I definitely want to get the audiobook because I want to give it to my dad, who's interested in this kind of stuff. And he's in that generation where he grew up around that, and he's in New York, and he doesn't read regular books, but he'll do an audiobook. I wonder what he'll think of this. So I'm going to look into that. Maybe for Father's Day. It'll be perfect timing.
Right. Well, thanks for joining us, Forrest, and thank you everyone for listening to this. I thought it was just very, very eye-opening.
Riveting.
And don't forget to rate and review us. And
with 5 stars only.
Yes, and we'll put links to Forrest's website on when we post about this episode on our Immunity Education Group website and our Facebook pages. And we will see you next time on the Vaccine Conversation.
Thanks, Forrest.
Thank you.
The information in this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as medical advice. Always consult your healthcare professional for information on vaccines and infectious diseases.